Red TV. Hello, Igor Ivanovich. Could you please tell us, in your opinion, who participated in the Maidan revolution when it was underway in 2013, and what did they want? I have said before that Maidan was simply a cover for a palace coup carried out by the oligarchs within Yanukovych's inner circle in order to rip Ukraine from Russia and move it to the so-called European sphere of influence as a banana republic. In the Maidan, there were several categories of people. It's important to separate Maidan and Grushevskovo Street. Grushevskovo Street was ultra-nationalists, essentially neo-Nazis, and Maidan itself was a mixture of Kiev intelligentsia, students, and moderate nationalists who did not think of themselves in terms of a fascist ideology, but nonetheless were quite nationalist. I'd like to point out that the majority of people in Kiev were against Yanukovych and more or less supported Maidan. The people I talked to there did not understand what this is going to lead to, trying to explain to them that this is going to lead to civil war, rip the country apart. They completely did not believe me. And the taxi drivers that I talked to, for example, all believed that Yanukovych is supported by Russian special forces, etc. And this was pushed to them by TV, of course, because TV and mass media were controlled by Yanukovych's enemies, and even the state media channels were, even if they said something in support of Yanukovych half-heartedly, they were showing the riot police beating protesters and did not show the riot police being beaten or killed. So if we talk about the situation more historically, the events of Maidan in Kiev are probably most similar to Moscow in 1991. So 20 years later, the same thing happened. The naive intelligentsia that believed that they're going to change something, the provocateurs among the government, the traitors among the government, who did everything not to stabilize the situation, but to provoke and egg the protesters on. A few radicals who provided a picture for the foreign mass media, and a conspiracy within the ruling elite. So the same scenario with a few things different here and there, and the same results essentially. So a fairly wide popular movement was like a donkey running after a carrot fixed in front of it, not realizing what the carrot even is. The circles that were interested in escalating the protest and starting the bloodshed were, of course, the foreign backers of the revolution and their local proxies. So the goal was to remove Yanukovych and replace him with a rabidly anti-Russian regime, which is what happened. First off, nationalists were always present in some number. if you recall, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, who came after Stalin, a Communist Party member, a Ukrainian, and a widely revered communist, he released all the Nazi collaborators and nationalists. As soon as Stalin died, all of the Bandera followers were amnestied, because even Stalin didn't want the country to lose any more people, so he didn't actually execute almost all of these people. He just sent them to prison for a while, and all of them were amnestied and came back in the mid-50s. They came back to Ukraine. Of course, they laid low, but a lot of them remained and propagated their ideology. So there were some roots. Yes, the roots were old and rotten and almost forgotten. But when after 1991 the separate Ukrainian government emerged, they very logically supported the nationalists as a guarantee against the people rising up, throwing them out, and reuniting with Russia. And of course, you have to understand that all of the Ukrainian governments were nationalist. Even Yanukovych, if you recall, he did not reinstate Russian as an official language. So you have to understand that, say, the neo-Nazi Yarosh and Yanukovych are the two wings of the same movement. One is more radical, the other one is more opportunist. But you have to understand that they're the same, and you have to understand that the population hated Yanukovych for that, and the more propaganda was pushed onto the people growing up with a full dominance of nationalists on TV, mass media, with a virtually total absence of counter-propaganda. There were a generation of people formed that did not know history, as the Western interests always want for people to adhere to their version of history and not know their ancestors who fought and died for the Soviet Union and against Nazis at 60 times the rate that they joined the Bandera gangs. No, not at all. The nationalists were always totally controlled. There was a group of oligarchs which was always in control, and during the Maidan I knew very well that, for example, Poroshenko alone was paying 500,000 hryvnia per day for the Maidan. And of course there were sponsors on the other side. Maybe someone from the Akhmetov circle was sponsoring the anti-Maidan, but that's how it worked. In Grushevskovo, yes, some of them were paid, but not all of them. And in Maidan, the majority of people were not paid. Of course, there were some volunteers, so-called volunteers, who went there basically to work full-time, but there were basically people who needed to be there in the evening and at night, so they wouldn't go home after the day closed. So they were paid a little bit. But you have to understand that, for example, the anti-Maidan, who was creating the opposite picture, they were all paid. And they were paid 500 hryvnia per day, which is about $70 per day at that rate. And for Ukraine, this is very decent money, even in the prosperous times of Yanukovych. plus, the free food, free tea. So we have to also understand when the anti-Maidan was over and the shift was done, part of the people got money from anti-Maidan and went to the Maidan square to protest, for free.
Почему, когда начался протест радикализироваться, когда начали появляться такие местные фашисты в этом Майдане, внутри Украины не нашлось ни одной из организаций, которая смогла бы противопоставить этому?
Well, tell me please, when in 1991 our so-called glorious democratic revolution happened, our Communist Party had how many? 17, 18 million members. The Communist Youth Union had quite the number. Why did none of them do anything, having many million members? It's the same question, because everybody was degraded, nobody believed in anything anymore, and nobody stood up. I remember the Soviet years. I did not live in the provincial areas, so probably the provinces were different. But in Moscow, nobody believed in communist ideas, at least among the youth. I've been in a communist youth union, as everybody, of course, and I remember all of it. It was just a ritual that you had to do. There were very few who believed, and they were viewed as freaks, lunatics.
В советское время это была руководящая роль партии, и внутри партии были изменения, а здесь была многопартийность, и ни одна из этих партий не взяла на себя ответственность сказать простым гражданам, что фашисты.
Well, imagine, tomorrow fascists come out and overthrow our government. Well, of course, they wouldn't be actually overthrowing the government, but because it's impossible to have any sort of a color revolution here, but there would be a camouflaged palace coup, like in Ukraine. Maybe it wouldn't even be camouflaged. If you remember the coup of 2000, Yeltsin basically said, "I'm tired, I'm leaving." That wasn't a democratic transfer of power, right? That was a bloodless coup. So I'm sure that if something like that happens, nobody will stand up. Do you think that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation would stand up? I see that you're waving your head. Yes, those people are part of the political system. They are reaping benefits of being a token opposition, officially sanctioned. And the leaders of the Communist Party and other opposition parties are essentially government officials. Government officials don't rock the boat. They can't stand up without an order. If they have no orders, they just sit tight and wait for them.
То есть ситуация на Украине, когда она получила такое развитие, это чуть-чуть вперед Россия.
Ukraine is the same as Russia. It is a part of Russia, and all the processes that happen in Russia happen in Ukraine. Slower, faster, but they eventually happen. So Maidan is the 1991 regime change. That's 20 years too late. If you remember, in 1991, Kiev was the regional capital, and there was nothing. There was no troubles. And 20 years later, this wave finally got to them. So what happened in Ukraine is also a trial run for what could happen in Russia. a palace coup carried out by elite interests, camouflaged by Maidan or Bolotnaya protests or something else. First off, in Ukraine, Nazism, pure Nazism, didn't win. There was an oligarch transfer of power that was completely against Russia. That's it. Nothing changed. Poroshenko is not any worse than Yanukovych. In terms of their quality, they are the same piles of crap. Of course, Yanukovych is dumber, Poroshenko is a little bit smarter, but they're essentially the same. They only care about profit and little else. These were called people who don't remember their roots, they don't care about the people. And you have to remember, Yarosh and various other Nazis did not come into power. Nazis were used by oligarchs for their purposes. Of course, I'm not a fan of Ukrainian Nazis or any other sort of Nazis, but it's a fact. Nazis were simply cannon fodder for the oligarchs, and their ideas are being used because they are politically expedient. If they become not expedient, they'd be removed. As for your question as to why I did something, you know, in some other situation, I could have been sitting quiet, but I had the opportunity to do something, to change something, and I took it. Believe me, I didn't have an opportunity to do anything in 1991 when I was very young. I didn't support the government, and I didn't support their opponents because it was clear that both are rotten. But then I couldn't do anything. And back then there was no other option. There was no third solution. And now I saw some opportunity for a third outcome, a third force. So I took it. In 1993, when the parliament was fighting the president, I was serving in the army. And although most of my friends supported the parliament, the only people I know who supported the government, I met through my service. So, in 2014, I was the right man in the right place that could do something, take a decision to improve things, and I took it. That's something I've been preparing for my whole life.
В какой атмосфере проходил референдум по присоединению к России, возвращению в Россию? Как люди себя ощущали? Была ли нервозность, какой-то страх? Какая атмосфера была на улицах и в домах?
You mean Simferopol, right? Because I haven't been to Sevastopol a whole lot. I went to negotiate with Berezovsky and some Ukrainian troops, but mostly I've been in Simferopol. So for the rest of Crimea, I can't really say, and I just want to say about what I've seen myself. Initially, the atmosphere was that people were not sure. In the first couple days, the police was still taking orders from Kiev. They were standing and trying to stop the people from going to rallies to support the people occupying the government buildings when the city hall was occupied. The weather was quite cold. The streets were completely covered with ice, so everybody was constantly falling down. These major streets were blocked by the police, who weren't heavily armed. They had maybe handguns, but no rifles. And people were trying to go and support the takeover of the administration buildings. Nobody really understood who took them over yet, but there were rumors that, our guys took them, and the police were stopping the people and turning them around. People were still listening to the police, but there were some streets open, some side streets, and the police knew they were open, but did not block them. Maybe they didn't have orders. So there were several hundred people in front of the city hall supporting, a few hundred people in front of the parliament, Crimean parliament, and that's about it. So in the first few days, it wasn't massive that, the entire population would support it. There were activists who supported it. There were some spectators. Modern people are quite infantile, so they came because it's interesting, because they wanna look, and most people were quite passive. They went to their jobs, they did their own things, and did not participate. In Sevastopol, what I've seen driving through when I visited it, it was supported by most people, but in Simferopol it was, Cossacks, communists, monarchists, political activists, basically people who cared about politics. They participated in this. In Simferopol, mostly this was organized by Aksionov and his Russian Unity movement. He gathered the largest number of people. Communists gathered some 150 people, etc. Aksionov, on the second day of the protests, got more than 3,000 people. I wasn't there when they got into a clash with the Crimean Tatars. I came the night after, but when they took over the airport, took over the train station, so they had a huge crowd for Simferopol, which is about 300,000. So that wasn't just popular support, but also organization. You have to understand, you can't have popular support without organization. At the time the Crimean events started, there wasn't much protest elsewhere. But later I was very well aware of it, because I was assistant to Sergei Valerievich Aksionov. I even had an ID. One of my friends still has it. It has still the Ukrainian seals, because there were no other official seals available. And my task was actually talking to delegates from other areas, because Aksionov was busy with the referendum, with Crimea, organizing the Republican government. So the task of talking to Russian Unity delegates, because Russian Unity was not just Crimea, it was quite powerful everywhere, basically were sent to me, and I talked to them. All of them were asking, what do we do? When will you guys come to us? When will we get support? So I saw how the protest developed. I made a map showing where the majority of the population supported us. supported reunification with Russia and or independence from Kiev. Of course, the Crimean independence hugely encouraged all the pro-Russian elements in Ukraine, everybody who wanted to go back to Russia, and all of them were sure that the Crimean scenario would be repeated elsewhere. It was like a thunderbolt strike. And not just in Russia, but in Ukraine as well. The government was completely demoralized. The same for the army and the police, and Russians and pro-Russian elements were hugely encouraged. So I was supported in this by Sergei Valerievich Aksyonov. He completely agreed with me on this, but we completely agreed in terms that we need to go and continue helping people liberate themselves. And the problem was that we didn't have any resources to do this. I had pretty much zero resources, and what we managed to assemble was the so-called special purpose battalion. It even took part in some actions in Crimea. So we had some 200 people and 160 trophy firearms, but we were disbanded within 2 weeks, essentially. So, if we managed to bring those 200 people instead of 52 that we had, that would have been huge. But that didn't happen. According to the new government, we were an illegal armed band, and we were disbanded. Since we're disciplined people, we handed our weapons over and disbanded.